highest highs with the lowest lows. That's like these days. World chained up, he on lockdown. Phone call 3 ways. I just pray that he find God now. It's no replay. On my way up to the top now.
Let's break down wholesaling, because I think this is exciting for people who don't know anything about real estate investing, building a business. The fact that wholesaling doesn't exist just in real estate, but every single industry out there. My favorite example of this is the grocery store. The end user is the person who purchases it to eat it. So when the grocery store buys it at 15 cents and sells it at 50, they're wholesaling. Now they bought the product, but
Right.
they're the middleman.
Right.
So for people who have no idea how to start or what the steps of a wholesale transaction are, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but if you could break wholesaling into 6 or 7 bullet points, what's that process look like?
Yeah. So let's assume, let's ignore the marketing piece of it.
Absolutely. Let's
Right.
start with
Like,
talking to a homeowner.
I'm talking to a seller. They're interested in selling their property.
Okay.
So because of one of the conditions that they're facing, they're willing to sell at a price that's acceptable to us. We'll put a contract in place. So really the first step in wholesaling, there's marketing and finding sellers and all that, but the first step in a wholesale transaction is get the contract in place.
Why?
That gives us the rights to do all of the next things that we need to do, right? Like we'll walk through those steps. But once the contract is in place, that seller has agreed to sell to us a specific property at a specific price at a specific time. And as long as we arrive at the closing table on that date with that amount of capital, they will be selling their home.
And what it also means is that they can't entertain offers or discussions from really anybody else now that the contract is signed.
Right. Real estate law is dictated by state law.
Sure.
Every state that I can think of, I really can't think of an exception. Once the seller signs the contract, they're effectively bound to sell it. There's some states that have some caveats, like some cooling off periods and specific limited time exceptions to that. But in a broad brush way, once the seller signs that they are going to accept some amount of capital in exchange for their house, that sale they're obligated in most states to do, and can, in some cases, be forced by a court to sell their home.
Got it. Okay. So first step is getting it under contract, getting a legally bound contract between you and the seller.
Bingo. And in each state, that may vary a little bit.
Sure.
One state may have a requirement or an element of a contract and another may not. But as long as you've met the threshold in your state that that's what a contract is dictated by, then you have a legally binding contract.
Right.
In our world, what we do next is we actually send that contract to any one of our attorney partners so that they can begin the title search. In some states, as opposed to where we send it to an attorney directly, you may send it to a title company who effectively performs the closing functions in the same way that an attorney does in our state.
Absolutely. And you can just look on Google, what is your state? Is it an attorney state or is it a title state? And
Bingo.
Very easy to find out.
And another way also, obviously, is just like get referrals from people in the environment, right?
You mean talk to people?
Got it. I know that's scary, but
it's scary.
If you go to a networking event, if you go to an event hosted by your local RIA, you'll quickly get a recommendation of the top 3 or 4 offices who are doing this type of work.
Cool.
So we've got the contract. The contract is off at the attorney. They're doing their work to make sure that the seller who signed this contract has the unique legal right to sell this property, or if there may be someone else who has an interest in it. And that is broadly what we describe as like having clear title. Like this person selling it has the right to sell this property without any other exceptions.
And they're just checking county records to make sure that the deed that's registered matches.
They're
very simply.
To keep it simple, that's the work they're doing.
Right.
They're making sure that the public record communicates that the property can be transitioned.
Understood.
So once we've done that, or while that's happening, really in our case, while that's happening, we're going to start talking to buyers about this property. And you can do that in a whole variety of ways, right?
What do you mean by buyers?
So we have a contract for a specific property, and we may decide in our business to purchase this directly ourselves, or we can choose to assign it, and we can talk a little bit more in detail what that specifically means, or we can choose to assign it to another buyer. So when I say a buyer in that case, I mean if we decide not to purchase it directly, one of our friends may be interested in buying this property and taking our position in this contract.
Got it.
And so we will spend time talking with various people in our market or in the market where the property is to understand if there's some level of interest to purchase this property at the given price that would be interesting.
So when we're talking to those buyers, we obviously are in the position to make money. So we're pitching these opportunities at an inflated rate to what we have it under contract at.
Yes, always.
Okay. How do we determine what that difference should be?
Given the condition of this property, what have houses like this one that are in, if it's rough shape, if it's in better shape, whatever, what price have they sold at in the market? And if there's a gap between that expectation and where we're under contract with the seller, obviously in our business, that's a good sign.
Absolutely.
So if we were under contract with a seller at say 160 and properties in the same or similar condition have sold at 190, that would give a potential wholesale fee or an assignment fee, those are synonymous, of about $30,000 in that case.
Which is attainable?
Yeah, we certainly have seen wholesale fees in that amount historically. We've seen some that are less, in our business. It seems like, the national average starts somewhere around probably $12,000 and, a good fee would be north of $20,000, generally speaking.
Yep. Tend to agree there.
So back to process. So we're going to spend time talking with these prospective buyers.
Yep.
Seeing if they're interested in a house that, again, we have under contract at 160, but that we're asking them if they'd be interested in paying 190. And we're going to field those offers for some period of time. And then we have processes in our office where we look at it and say, okay, we've been out in the market. We've gotten feedback where there are buyers. This offer from XYZ company or this offer from our friends,
Individuals.
Doug, like we've got a friend named Doug and his business partner who buy things, so like, hey, do we want to go with Doug's team? Do we want to go with this LLC? And we'll make that decision in-house, and then we'll complete an assignment contract. So the whole world of wholesaling, what's really cool about it is you really only have two documents. You have a contract to purchase that you sign between yourself and the seller of a property.
Which is the offer. That's
the
signed.
Offer, yep. And then you have an assignment agreement, which is just a document that you agree with your end buyer, which takes the rights that you had to buy that property and it passes those to them, or the legal term for that is assignment.
So basically, once that assignment is executed, the end buyer is responsible for completely honoring everything that contract stated at an inflated price.
Well, not even really an inflated price, right? Like normally, I know we're simplifying for the purpose of the discussion, but the contract will state a price, right? The 160, and then our assignment agreement will just state the additional one. It'll state the 190 or the 30,000, depending on the format you use.
But what happens when the buyer purchases it at 190 but sees the contract stated at 160? I mean, how do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, this is a question we get a lot. Well, what happens when my buyer sees that I'm making money on this? Well, first, it's important your buyer understands, of course you're going to be making money on the property, right? Like
Right.
You're in the business to operate in a certain way. And I think what we've done, or tried to do anyways, is we've tried to make sure buyers understand, I want to make sure that this property meets your metrics at the full asking price that I'm offering. So in that case, the 190.
Right.
Whether I have the property at 189 or $12,000 is a little bit irrelevant. If it makes sense for you at the 190, then that's what we want to look at. And I think what we've tried to develop over the last couple of years is just to make sure that those individuals, the buyers that we're talking with, understand and agree with that philosophy.
So it's kind of like, if the numbers work for you, why are you looking in my pockets?
Yeah. And then look, I think the cycle where the business has been the last 2 years, I think that question wasn't asked very often.
I think so.
I think where the industry is going over the next 18 months to 2 years, I think that question will become a little more common. And we may need to field a bit of that.
Absolutely. And I just want to bring up a couple different examples here of how there are caveats in this. So for example, let's say that we're going to use we want to sell this for $190. People inherit properties. So if I received a property from a deceased relative or from, pick a different example, what did I pay for that house?
Yeah, I mean, effectively
nothing.
Nothing, or an extremely low number.
Right. We're talking about fees and closing costs here.
Like if we go back to our finance days, our basis is really low.
Basis is super low. So if I inherited a property, do I have to lessen my benefit because of the amount of money I'm making? That's an extremely silly argument.
Right.
However, at the same time, let's say that a property could sell for $190 and we have it under contract at $160. Obviously, that's a great $30,000 fee. But what if the buyer that we're dealing with wants to buy 5 properties a year from us, or has offered us guidance or advice in the past? Do you still use that same, hey, if your numbers work, you should buy it? Or how do you approach that?
I think what we've tried to do is we obviously have a preference to do deals with people we've done deals with before. So in our world, we haven't used the term quote unquote VIP buyers, but if we had a list of people who were VIP buyers, they'd be the people who we've done deals with before, who were easy to work with, whose financing was easy, who all the metrics, right? They didn't beat us up last minute.
They did what they were supposed to.
All those things.
Yep.
I think what we try and do in this process where we look at a situation, like, if we just have one offer on a property, this question's kind of irrelevant, right? But
Absolutely.
in situations where we have multiple offers on properties, I think what we try and weigh is, will we always take the highest offer? No, not necessarily. There's a value to working with people who we, again, understand, who we have a relationship with. And so I think where this really comes into play in our business is if we built that relationship, then there's certainly an availability to take a number that's a little bit lower than the top of the market, and everyone still feel really comfortable.
Yeah, I agree. I think obviously people like the fact that you look out for them, give them a little bit of a discount. And if I'm cashing a $25,000 check instead of a $30,000 check, I'm still pretty happy.
I'm still doing just fine.
Absolutely. Okay, let's catch back up. So we have started with talking with the seller, and this is a seller that wants to sell their property at a number that makes sense. So after we talk with the seller, we get it under contract, legally bound. Then we send it to the attorney or title office so that they can verify all the information, at which point we start either determining if it's going to be a fit for us ourselves, or we're going to bring it to a friend that we know. Once we find the person, we do the assignment agreement, which transfers the rights of the contract from us to the end buyer. And that's where we fell off. So we sign the assignment contract is it between the seller and the buyer, or is it between the wholesaler and the buyer?
Most contracts allow the wholesaler to unilaterally assign a contract to a buyer. So most
the
of the
seller doesn't know.
They may know, they may be aware. In our business, we go out of our way to make sure they're aware.
Absolutely.
that can be one of the exit strategies. But they should know first. They should know. But in our contract and most of the contracts that most of our peers use, it's a unilateral assignment. So the seller's not actually signing any documents. They're just aware that closing is going to happen on the date dictated in the contract as discussed.
Absolutely. Wholesaler and buyer unilaterally sign the contract.
Yes.
Then, how long does it take for you to find that buyer?
It can often take a little bit of time. I mean, it can take a week, 10 days. It can take some time. And when you've got a 30-day close on the calendar, you're 10 days into a full close when you're kind of finally getting everything put together.
Okay, so 30-day close. We're about 10, 15 days into it. So we sign the assignment contract, and there's about 10 to 15 days left.
Yeah.
What's happening in those 10 to 15 days?
Well, we've got to work with the buyer to make sure that they can still complete. Like, we've walked through the property in a lot of cases, but they still need to complete some due diligence. They may need to bring a lender through. So there's kind of a lot of things that the buyer may need to do in a relatively short period of time, making sure, back to the criteria piece up for our buyers, making sure that they can accomplish those things in the timeline is part of our screening criteria.
So what you mean to say is, even though a buyer may be interested in purchasing this property, they might not be ready to go tomorrow. Yeah. And they need to, get their ducks in a line too.
Yeah, and they may not be able, this is back to the whole being selective about who we get to enter into contracts with. We may choose not to enter into a contract with a ready, quote unquote, ready, willing, and able buyer because they're not able to get it done in the timeline that we have that we've laid out.
Right. So if it's a 30-day contract and they're saying I need at least 60 days to close, even though they're a buyer that we use all the time, we can't use them on this deal.
Absolutely. Okay. And we ran into that with one of the teams I mentioned earlier about, they were just in between projects. That one was getting ready to close, but they had to wait on that closing timeline before they could come into ours.
Right.
So we certainly see that in this space.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that. So sign the assignment contract, and now we have 10 to 15 days where we're discussing things with the buyer.
Yeah. And what I wanted to make the point of our approach early on and what we advocate for others today is our job is still to be the hub of that transaction.
Even though we're not
the buyer any longer on that contract, that buyer does not sit in the driver's seat with our seller, right? Like,
why is that?
It's just really important that we continue to manage the relationship. We've developed rapport with this seller in a way that's really productive. It's our job to make sure that the buyer executes the purchase in line with the terms that we've agreed with the seller, or that we have agreed with the seller, or we work with the buyer and seller to kind of mediate. Like, we really become kind of professional mediators through the end of this close. We want to make sure the seller's needs are met. We want to make sure the buyer's needs are met. And if we're doing our job properly, that's an effective transaction.
So it's not a assignment contract wholesaler gets to kick their feet.
Throw your hands up, everything's good.
Not that.
I think there are wholesalers out there who behave that way, and I think it's less effective.
I would agree. So it's really just, confirming that everything's on track and going back to no one's going to do anything as good as you are. We don't, even though a buyer that we're friends with may be excellent in the real estate space and does amazing work, is their bedside manner, how do they treat people in difficult situations, or are they single track focused? So being able to make sure that the seller is comfortable throughout the whole process is definitely a task we take.
Yeah, and then the last part is we have closing, we have settlement, right? And so that's when the seller's going to go and sign the deed, transferring the ownership from them to our end buyer. The buyer will come in and sign any loan documents that may be associated with them and the transaction. They'll wire the funds into the closing attorney's trust accounts, and then the closing disclosures will be published, and we'll make sure to review those and make sure, obviously, that our assignment fee is listed there, that the seller's getting their proper price, that the seller's getting credit for any that the buyer's getting credit for any amounts of deposits they've paid. So there's certain things that we need to look at those closing statements and make sure that they're done properly. And really, and we've had this situation happen. There's been disagreements about how much taxes are prorated or these types of things. Our continued engagement have led to successful transactions in that case.
Absolutely. Okay, so real quickly, we're just going to summarize this because we went in a lot of tangents, but talk to sellers, get a property under contract. Send that contract to an attorney or to a title office to make sure that everything is kosher. Then we're going to talk to our financial teams as well as potential other investors in the space to determine what's the best way to go forward with this transaction. If we do decide to go to another investor, we're going to wholesale this property with an assignment contract. And once the assignment contract, which dictates a new price at the same terms, is signed by the wholesaler and the end buyer, the only thing that we need to do now is just be on the team of both the buyer and the seller, making sure that the needs up to closing are still being met.
Yep.
Then closing docs are signed and wires are sent out right then and there.
Yeah, I mean, effectively the same day normally. In some places in the country, maybe it takes a day or something, but here in North Carolina, it generally takes the same day.
That's awesome.
And then you get a check and then rinse and repeat.
Rinse and repeat. Well,
There you guys go.
later.
On my way up to the top now, that's on me.